2020 has been a frightening year. The world is in turmoil and hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost to a pathogen that has run rampant through global populations. New Zealand took action fast and efficiently, effectively eliminating it from community transmission. Now we are left with the difficult road ahead, rebuilding our economy while we are surrounded with a global recession not seen in more than a century. But crisis equals opportunity. Today we have the chance to review where we as a nation stand, what is important, and how we may be better prepared should events like this plague us again. Protecting our food security, the environment on which our food security is based, is key. An environmental war chest upon which the economy of our future can rely. This is the story of just one of those war chest resources, one of our most important protein sources, and how saving them may well save us in the future. This is my favourite time of day. Below me, the night guard is growing weary, and the daytime animals are stirring as they prepare for another busy day at sea.
My name's Bhana. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I've been working on and in the ocean my entire life.
This is where I earn my living, where I hunt for my food, and where I'm most at home.
In my lifetime, I've seen some dramatic changes in the oceans, both here in New Zealand and in the Pacific. Changes that have made it harder for me to make a living from the sea. And I'm not the only one. Most of my commercial fishing friends will say the same.
Climate change, pollution, but most significantly, the decline of almost all the animals that call this place home. And that's what I want to talk about.
I want to tell you the story of our fish and how their decline in numbers affects you as well as me. Because on our current path, our grandchildren are unlikely to experience what we've seen and so often taken for granted.
To find the answers, I travelled around the globe, talking to leaders in the fields of economics, fisheries management, and marine sciences. I met politicians, anthropologists, and fishermen. And here at home, I tried to figure out what all I had learned means to us as New Zealanders. Where do I start? Let's start at the beginning. This is the Kiwi lifestyle. Summer holidays at the beach, fresh fish on the barbecue. Heading to the beach for summer, catching fish and collecting a feed of pippies is as much a part of us, a part of who we are, as, well, pavlova or LMP. It's a part of our culture, our music, our arts, and perhaps most significantly, our sense of place. It's also a key part of our economy, a key part of both our food security as a nation, as well as playing a vital role alongside our other primary industries in supporting us economically at this difficult time in world history. An economic lifeline that fuels international trade, bringing in millions every year. But what would happen if our fisheries were to collapse, and if we were to lose the food security they provide, the jobs and the revenue? And what happens to us as New Zealanders?
That's what scares me the most, is it's more than just about fish. Who we are as a people will get eroded. And I think all Kiwis are proud that we could come down to a beach like this, we can dig for some tours, grab some mussels off the rocks. It makes us feel good about who we are. It's part of our identity. And it makes us feel good about ourselves. It is part of what makes this creature that the world knows as a Kiwi, gives us the disposition that we have, because we've got a connection with our sea. And without the ability to have access to that, we'll lose that connection and we'll lose who we are.
Well, the reality is that day is much closer than we've been led to believe. One of our most important protein sources, and the Pacific's most important protein source, has become too expensive for many to buy, and even harder to catch. Our commercial industry is dumping fish, perfectly good fish, and I'm not talking a few kilos either.
I'm talking millions and millions of kilograms every year. So how can the Ministry of Primary Industries, the organisation trusted with the governance and protection of one of our most valuable resources, allow this to happen?
There are a few hard questions that need answering, and we need to listen to the experts if our export industries and our food security as a nation are to continue to support us in the years to come. So what is the real state of our fisheries, of our oceans today? What's doing okay and what's not? What can stay the same and what needs to change? Let's start by looking at the problems our fisheries are currently facing. Now, we know New Zealand recreational fishermen take a substantial amount of fish every year. It's who we are. A report released last year by an internationally respected research company states that New Zealand's total recreational catch is close to 11,000 tonnes a year. Now that seems like a lot, but let's put that in perspective. 11,000 tonnes is less than 3% of all the fish taken from New Zealand waters every year. But hey, the government manages those fish stocks, so surely there's enough fish in the ocean, right? Wrong.
The fishing surveys that we've done at the ramp have declined, like Hapooka bass, for example, went down about 83%. Gurnard went down about 40%. This is over the last 10-year period. Snapper about 50%.
And it's not just the recreational sector that can reminisce on days gone by.
You just wallop a school of fish and you just fill the thing right up. She was history. And you'd have to call 5 other boats over to try and help you, and it'd be 15, 20 hours later before you got the net emptied out. I don't know how much fish was caught in those days. I don't know how much fish was dumped either. I'd hate to think.
And you only have to look back a few generations here in New Zealand to see just how badly our fish stocks are doing. Hapooka or groper used to be a shallow water species. Fishermen didn't need sounders and technology to find the fish. So if our fisheries are in such bad shape, what exactly has happened? To find out, we need to fast forward 60 years from these scenes in 1925. It was the mid-80s. Ronald Reagan was US president and the Reagan effect was taking hold. Privatisation was taking over the world. New Zealand's fisheries were managed via the licensing of fishing vessels. However, stocks were rapidly declining as no catch limits were in place.
In a controversial plan aimed at saving the industry, the government proposes to limit the amount that fishermen can catch, reduce the number of fishermen themselves, and introduce a radical new system for using the fishing grounds.
In 1986, fisheries introduced the Quota Management System, or QMS, a system that today is touted as world-leading, and around the world there are more than a dozen countries using the same or a similar system.
If we don't do something towards controlling the situation and allowing some of those species that are under threat to recover, then we're going to see quite a lot of the inshore fishermen actually being forced out of business and in fact going bankrupt.
Let's take a look at how the QMS works. Our Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, extends 200 miles offshore and is made up of 10 fisheries management areas, or FMAs, so that different species can be managed on a regional basis. Most species have a total allowable catch, or TAC, and within that is the total allowable commercial catch, or TACC. These TACCs are applied to the various FMAs to form the QMAs, depending on where the fish are found and in what numbers. TACCs can be reviewed yearly, and this is done by MPI and based on new science and the catch rates of commercial. The TACC was divided into individual transferable quotas, or ITQs, and these were given to the commercial fishermen for free and in perpetuity.
You have to remember that in the 80s, the whole spirit of the age was privatization, wasn't it? And markets, and then the Soviet Union collapsed in '91, and markets have won, haven't they? And Margaret Thatcher with her Tina doctrine, there is no alternative. Okay, so none of this ever happens in a political or social vacuum. And so that was the spirit of the time, okay? And of course you had to privatize stuff.
It was perceived that such quota should be given away, and they should be given in perpetuity.
Now wait a minute, and I keep asking, where in the sacred text of my discipline am I to find a paragraph that says efficiency is served by giving away a resource to the private sector for free?
We don't do this with timber. We don't do it with oil. For some reason in fisheries, and we have this entire academic discipline or sub-discipline, fisheries economics, that produces justifications for this grand giveaway.
And then you make it tradable, so it becomes a commodity.
But just look at the libraries of critical academic analysis and writings about the system and how they work, the consequences, the social implications. We refer to it as a neoliberal paradigm, but it's actually not a very good example because it's much more related to feudalism. It's a feudal arrangement. It's the giving of entitlements of to a class of people in a certain time. Feudalism is all about that. And then to have and to hold.
The first generation did extremely well. They just sort of got given this public good for free, and you started to get a whole class of slipper skippers or quota lords who would lease out their quota and just sit at home. They also call them armchair fishermen. And these armchair fishermen did extremely well.
Now, the ITQs, or individual transferable quotas, were, as the name suggests, transferable, allowing them to be traded and sold. Suddenly, the paper was worth more than the fish themselves. Today, 78% of the total New Zealand quota is owned by just 10 commercial entities who collect rent from those doing the fishing.
This aggregation and consolidation that occurs is really to benefit a cartel. It is not to benefit New Zealand, and it is certainly not to benefit the fishermen, the fishing families and the fishermen that operate in New Zealand.
These people will claim that an ITQ fishery is efficient because we got rid of all the small ones, and now there's 6 great big vessels catching 97% of the tack, and this is efficient? Okay. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm almost speechless at the stupidity of it. What we're interested in a fishery, a small-scale fishery, whatever, is sustainability, and can people make a living doing it? That's all that matters, okay?
So he instigated the QMS to fix a problem, falling numbers of fish. What was the result? Multi-million-dollar companies were able to take over. Less tax is now being paid per fish to the government, to us, the owners of the fish. And there are fewer jobs, more specifically in the regions. At a time where increasing unemployment in today's COVID-19 driven recession is putting those communities under extreme pressure. So the QMS is failing the people, the fishermen and the fish stocks. And if it's failing the people, then surely it's failing Māori as well.
If you don't have and aren't able to exercise kaitiakitanga, then you lose your mana. And that is the situation that MPI, Fisheries New Zealand, and the ministers have put Māori in, because there's nothing to catch. When my mother-in-law passed away, we had to go and get our kaimoana from Moana Pacific, because that's what they now call te kāpata kai. And you get your customary fish from the commercial fishermen. That's not right.
As Hugh said, the system doesn't work for Māori. So who actually owns the fish?
It's funny, people think they own the fish. Well, you don't own the fish. And you especially don't own the habitat of the fish, which is what supports the fish. And so, get real. It's an absurd idea that people can own what's public property.
Surely a return to more sustainable stock levels and environmentally friendly harvesting methods is in the best interests of all stakeholders.
The public interest is not about maximum sustainable yield. It's about having an abundant fishery. For mana whenua, I shudder to think how they're feeling. Back at the marae, where they're struggling to manaki manuhiri, feed their visitors with the delicacies that the marae has a reputation for having an abundance of. The cupboard is bare. It's empty. Where are they? They've been bulk harvested into oblivion and shipped offshore.
Now, not every country is getting it wrong, and some who have are well down the track to restoring their fisheries. A good example is the Faroe Islands. To start their reform, they created a set of values on which to base their new management system.
You start with sustainability, and then who owns the fish? People of the Faroe Islands own the fish. People of New Zealand own the fish.
The Faroes' reform was based on the following principles. All fisheries must be biologically, economically, and socially sustainable. All living marine resources remain the property of the people and cannot become the property of private companies or individuals or be sold abroad. New legislation will prevent private sales of licences and fishing rights. Fishing rights are to be granted in line with the principles of a market-based system. Catches will be landed in the Faroes and processed there for added value. Only Faroese-owned companies registered in the Faroes, paying taxes in the Faroes, may seek to participate in Faroese fisheries. And the government will remove all foreign ownership from the industry by 2022. But perhaps the most significant part of their reform is the introduction of a resource rental system, generating millions and millions of dollars in revenue for the government.
You know what they're going to do with that revenue from the fishery? They're going to put it in the healthcare system. No kidding. Now, is this smart or what?
Quotas or fishing rights can never be privatized. They're always the property of the people. And so access to fishing is always a license, a time-limited license that you should that you get from the government, and that you also have to pay the resource rent to the people and government.
So to be clear, the fish belong to us, not commercial. And the question should be, how do we want to see them managed on our behalf? Perhaps a good way to start figuring out how we fix this problem is to take a real hard look at the QMS's failings and then create a basic set of principles on which to base a reform, in the same way that the Faroes have. In 2018, Fisheries Minister Stuart Nash was forced to make a cut to the quota of crayfish in Cray 2 area, reducing the commercial catch from 200 tonnes a year down to 80. In reality, the fishery should have been closed, as numbers had dropped so low that marine scientist Dr. Nick Shears had declared crayfish functionally extinct in the Hauraki Gulf.
Over time, the numbers have declined in the reserve. There's a number of reasons for that, but it largely reflects what's going on in the wider fishery. So currently it's about 5%, the biomass outside versus inside the reserve. So if you sort of considered the reserve to be an unfished reference point. But we actually know that the populations in the reserve have also declined a lot compared to what they were in the 90s. So if we use our values from the 90s as some sort of reference point, the biomasses that we're getting outside the reserve are at about 1%.
And at 1%, crayfish no longer play a part in the ecosystem, making them functionally extinct. And the loss of our kelp forests to kinner barrens are a direct result. The targeted and systematic depletion of the species by commercial interests not only affects us, it has a catastrophic impact on the ecosystem as well, including marine reserves like Goat Island and the Poor Knights. It's important to note that marine reserves are not immune to overfishing. None in New Zealand are large enough to offer protection to anything other than the most sedentary of species. And they offer no protection at all to the pelagic species. They also have the effect of concentrating fishing pressure in other areas. So without reducing overall catch rates, they do little to help our declining stocks. Now, Nick and the scientists at Auckland University have been vocal about the crashing numbers of crayfish for years, and they simply weren't heard. How can the findings of one of our greatest research and learning institutions not have a voice when it comes to the monitoring of our fisheries? And if you think catching a cray for tea was always pretty hard, think again. This is footage from the West Coast in the 1950s, where crayfish were harvested in trawl nets. Yep, they caught them in nets, not pots. The crayfish were out on the sand, and a bottom trawl at the right time would yield catches like these. So the fishery, even down the west coast of the South Island, has changed dramatically since we began fishing. Now those days are clearly behind us, but surely maintaining stocks at sustainable levels is absolutely critical. One of the problems is the commercial sector sells a model for sustainable fish stocks that economists and fisheries experts around the world say is a lie. Whether they insist 20% of original biomass is optimal, or even 30%, the science tells us otherwise.
If you reduce it to 50%, the biomass, you get the maximum sustainable yield. You don't get the maximum sustainable yield at any other level. In no way is a reduction to 20% of the earlier biomass justified by any theory.
As for Cray 2, Nick's estimates of 1% or less give us a clear idea of just how unreliable current stock monitoring methods really are. Remember, our universities are our country's leading research institutions, and yet their research on fish numbers is rarely included in stock assessments. Nor is the work of the world's leading scientists when it comes to what percentage of original biomass gives us the maximum yield for fishing. Critical for the survival of the fish, the fishermen who rely on them for a living, and us as consumers.
If you have a situation in your country that where the debate, the scientific debate, has created a situation where 20 or 30% of original biomass is acceptable, you can say that the entire debate has become pathological because there is not one single scientific reason that would justify this.
And it's not just the loss of the fish. The QMS is also responsible for the loss of fishermen in our most vulnerable regional communities. In the name of economic efficiency, small was replaced with big. Bigger boats with fewer fishermen, and those boats based out of major ports rather than our smaller regional ones. Entire communities lost their opportunity for employment. Generational family histories were lost overnight to privatisation. Towns died, unemployment rose, and today many coastal communities are still suffering. In 1986, when the QMS was introduced, there were more than 6,000 registered fishing boats around New Zealand. Today, there are around 1,100. We're not taking less fish either. Instead, we're using bigger boats and more environmentally destructive fishing methods. More significantly for the regions, the fishing fleets are more centralised in the bigger ports, resulting in the loss of thousands of jobs.
Processing plants closing right, left and centre. We see the relics on the side of the road at Kaio, Hikurangi Fisheries, Happy Yovich. Suddenly all that commerce, all that trade, all the IOUs just gone.
Tiny little places like the Taieri River mouth used to be a thriving fishery, and now it isn't.
Aotearoa Great Barrier, classic case study, over 20 families involved in commercial fishing, high value, artisanal, low impact, and then one by one, they were cashing up.
And New Zealand is not the only country to suffer the same regional fate. In Iceland, another country touted as having this world-leading QMS system, the story is the same.
They pushed 1,043 small boats into the ITQ system with the big companies, and today there are hardly any left. Don't you just love the Icelandic summer? It's always the same story. ITQ systems, like we are running in Iceland, they are designed, specifically designed for big business, for big companies. And the small fisheries, they will always, in all cases, lose out.
And it's not just about jobs. Fishing for many is far more important than just a paycheck.
A lot of these small coastal communities are very resource dependent. So anything that happens to the resource, whether it's because of ecological change or other kinds of change, indeed, in terms of the rights to harvest, is instrumental to their well-being and survival.
And then you get into real problems with isolation, depression, anxiety, nervousness about the future, and all of these very real, they're very personal, but they're very real impacts that we see that affect psychological and even physical well-being in people. And so, of course, it's easy to say, you know, changes in a fishery system, well, it just changes the way people have jobs and people move around for jobs all the time, don't they? That's not at all true, because very much fisheries is not a job, it's a livelihood, and it's bound by place. And when those things separate from each other, all of the social aspects start to break down.
People's lives and human welfare gets in the way of pure economic logic or neoliberal pure economic logic.
Small-scale fisheries are a part of the future's solutions. They are not today's problems. And there must be something dead wrong with a fishery management system that takes out those who are the most sustainable, spend the least amount of fuel, they use fishing gear that doesn't harm the environment. A fishery management system that takes these boats out is a bad system.
One of the most visual and upsetting examples here in New Zealand of this bad system is the dumping of fish.
It's not designed to protect the fishery, it's designed to make money out of it, and this is what's happening in the pursuit of big, big dollars. Corporate greed, in fact.
I would hate to think just literally how many tons of snapper that we've driven past, and that's just what we can see. Oh, there's 3 over there. We have been planing what probably been a mile now, eh, guys? Yep. And the whole time we're steaming, look at them all around us. Snapper, beautiful fish like this. I mean, what would that fish mean to any one of us if we caught that today? It would mean a heck of a lot, let alone the spawning potential. It's just, you know, we're out here fishing in a tournament trying to promote sustainable fishing and release, and to see this go on, like, it really does upset me.
Dumping or discarding has to be the most offensive abuse of our fisheries. So why is it allowed? Aren't the commercial fishing companies breaking the law? A lot of the time, yes. And the reason for the lack of prosecution in the face of damning evidence appears to be the capture of the regulatory body, the Ministry of Primary Industries, or MPI. Their limited number of observers on our commercial fishing boats have filed over 160 observer reports, but most remain hidden from the public. When MPI surveillance operations Achilles, Hippocamp and Apate were thrown into the public eye, what was revealed was frightening. They found that inshore fishing trawlers were dumping between 1/3 and 2/3 of their catches, with Achilles revealing that between 20 and 100% of unwanted quota species are thrown overboard. There was evidence of killing and non-reporting of endangered Hector's dolphins, and the list goes on.
These reports are very detailed. They've been put together by experts. They have very detailed analysis, which should be informing fisheries management, but they're not. You look at the stock assessment reports, they're not referred to. And in fact, stock assessment reports say there is no information about illegal fishing. Rubbish. That's a deliberate lie.
Now, I want to read you an excerpt from an MPI Observer report where the Observer discovered the widespread practice of high grading and dumping of fish, as well as unreported killing of protected species like Hector's dolphins. Now, high grading is where you throw away the smaller, less desirable fish, still perfectly good to eat, so that you can keep the bigger, better value ones.
We, MPI, have known about these dumping, discarding issues for many years, and it would appear that we have done little to combat it, as it would be very difficult to explain and unpleasant at best. He went on to say, there's also the matter regarding the deliberate non-reporting of Hector's dolphins that could have a similar, if not more dramatic, flow-on negative effect. We have never had such compelling evidence to prove what we have known for a long time. It is imperative, in my opinion, that we act positively and timely to mitigate the risk that may result due to a lack or a perceived lack of action on our part.
Nothing was done. And there are several reports like this that state MPI needs to act, and yet here we are. Commercial was now fully in control of a government department.
The Sea Around Us report went as far as to suggest that the volume of unreported dumped fish per year exceeds the entire recreational catch by New Zealanders. More than 10,000 tonnes of perfectly good fish. In fact, between 1950 and 2010, it's estimated that New Zealand's unreported dumped commercial catch was more than 14 million tonnes of fish. That's enough at today's consumption rates to feed the whole of New Zealand for 125 years. Just take a moment to think about that, because what we're suggesting is that commercial fishing is controlling a government department, as well as influencing political parties. Surely not here in New Zealand. Now, those same reports also revealed the widespread practice of non-reporting of marine mammals being caught and killed in nets. And the impact on a couple of our only endemic species, the Hectors and Maui dolphins, is cause for real concern.
So just a few months ago, there was 5 Hectors dolphins caught in one net to the north of Banks Peninsula, and so that tells you something about what's going on there.
A lot of people would say that it's not just fishing. There are other environmental impacts that are affecting the population as well.
There are other concerns for sure. Pollution is another one, but there is nothing that comes anywhere near close to fishing, certainly nowhere near close to the direct impact of fishing, of actually catching the dolphins.
And while the Hectors dolphin is listed as endangered, its cousin, the Maui, is teetering on the brink of extinction.
There are 57 alive. Let's round it up. Let's call it 60 just for the sake of round numbers. That means that they're mammals, so their sex determination's same as in us, so roughly 30 of them are going to be female. We also know that of those 30, about half are going to be reproductively mature. So we have 15 reproductively mature Maui's dolphins in the world. When you're down to that number, you can't afford to lose one. You can't take the risks with those animals. You've got to get the fisheries that have the potential to kill those animals, you've got to get them out of the area where those animals are.
So we're saying, if you want to fish inside the habitat of an endangered dolphin, then please don't use fishing methods that kill dolphins.
Nothing against fishing, absolutely nothing against fishing. The key thing is method. And the methods that have the risk, they've got to go.
So some of our fishing methods are responsible for catching and killing our protected and endangered dolphins. And of those recorded, almost all just happen to be caught on boats where there are observers on board. This is called the observer effect. And remember, just a tiny fraction of the total fishing days by New Zealand fishing boats are monitored by observers. So how many are going unreported? And what about the impact on our other native species?
The way that we go about commercial fishing in New Zealand actually is at an enormous cost to a whole lot of species that are not the target species. Seabirds, we have more than 80% of New Zealand's seabirds at risk of extinction, and yet we're, by our estimate, catching at least 15,000 of them through fishing methods. Well, that just can't be acceptable. You know, last year, Forest and Bird published some material about the by-kill of penguins on the commercial set net fishing industry. And almost all of the reported penguin deaths occurred on the tiny fraction of boats that actually had observers.
Our marine wildlife brings in tens of millions of tourist dollars to our local economies every year. It's vital that we do everything we can to protect this industry. We just cannot allow fishing practices that might damage or destroy our tourism industry to continue. As Liz said, we're not saying stop fishing, we're just saying use sustainable and marine mammal-friendly methods. All these problems stem from the QMS. It's a system that has allowed big fishing companies to set the standard and make decisions. Decisions that should be made by scientists and government.
You have in New Zealand one of the best examples of industry that has captured the science in a way that is unthinkable, in a way that is unacceptable.
The quota management system that we have here does incentivise a whole bunch of pretty perverse behaviours And obviously the dumping of perfectly good fish is one of the worst. And so we've seen very large-scale dumping in New Zealand. It's been caught by the government regulator, the Ministry of Primary Industries, and Ministry of Fisheries before that. It's been revealed by their own investigations many times, but has almost never been prosecuted, and certainly the big companies don't get prosecuted, they get let off.
Let's have a look at those key problems. The QMS is not the world-leading management system it was purported to be, and for 56% of our fish stocks or substocks, there has been no assessments done. In many fish stocks, the allowable catch is never achieved, meaning the quota system fails to do what it was brought in to do, protect species from overfishing. The system has allowed big business to take over 80%, and money is now the bottom line when it comes to species management. Industrialised fishing techniques have created issues when it comes to bycatch and environmental degradation. And the QMS has destroyed regional fishing fleets and led to thousands of job losses in our most vulnerable communities. And what about Māori? Well, we've often been criticised for our level of customary take. However, it remains at less than 1% of all fish taken. And initially, Māori's treaty rights were completely left out of the QMS, with little or no thought given to how the QMS may affect us culturally.
The system does not work for Māori, for tangata whenua. It may be working for some quota holders, but that trickle down has not happened. And anyway, in the meantime, we've lost the customary access. 250 years ago, Captain Cook, this November, sailed through between the mainland and the island, and he named this the Bay of Plenty. And that's because it was abundant with work-ups and boil-ups all the way across the bay. And today it is the Bay of Empty. The politicians can't be trusted. Koretaki. Sad.
But there's another loss that Māori have suffered under the QMS. The loss of opportunity to become a fisherman, a livelihood that has been part of our culture for all time.
A lot of them were subsistence type fishermen, but you know, they love being on the sea. They took their kids out, they provided for the community, and it was just a lot more Māori on the water back then. If you're Māori in the fishing industry and you're not a big corporate, you're like that lone survivor. So certainly the numbers are nothing like they were.
Now, the 2004 Māori Fisheries Act made sure that Māori interests were catered for under the QMS. And on the face of it, it looked like a good deal. But when you take a closer look, it's a bit like blankets for land.
It's really sad because that's a perverse currency, shares in TACC. It's proven to be a rubbish asset for most Māori. They have not been able to turn that into a meaningful economic well-being. In fact, there are a great deal of Māori who are deeply embarrassed. Their whakamā, or shame, at seeing depleted fisheries.
Now, I want to make it very clear that our commercial fishermen are not the villains here. They have to work to pay the rent like the rest of us, and most of our fishermen are renters, not owners. The problem lies with the system and the big companies that control our fishery, and not the fishermen themselves.
Whether you're driving a huge big factory trawler or a little floundering boat or a snapper longliner, you're out there, you're there because you love it. And you won't find too many fishermen that are on the water doing the job because they think it's going to make them $1 million. Just like you and I, they love the sea. But unfortunately, they've lost control. They don't own the quota anymore. All the power is in the hands of big companies. And then if you go a step further, the shareholders of big companies. Now, does some shareholder who's bought an investment portfolio, who's never been fishing in their life, do they really give a shit what someone's doing to the ocean? They just want to see a bigger dividend payout. They want to see the bottom line improve.
Falling fish stocks are a cause for real concern, but they also create real conflict and put immense pressure on the last of our small-scale operators. Operators who work hard to be sustainable and harvest their fish with care.
I fish in the sort of super close range, so I'm pretty much day to day right on the bottom end, the southern end of Hawke's Bay. So the changes I've seen in that area have been fish stocks declining. I've seen stakeholder conflicts increasing. And yeah, in general, an inshore industry which is slowly degrading.
It's no future to be an owner-operator. The system doesn't allow it, and it's just too damn hard. And at the end of it, you've got an old dog of a boat, 60 years old. Most of our boats, the average age of the boats in the fleet's 35 years through the owner-operator fleet. It's got to be a fundamental change in a different way of how we actually get access. At the moment, someone else owns that access, and they're taking a whole lot of money out of it and giving me what's left, and they call that lease, or it's just an access fee, basically. I need to be able to still have an access fee, which is going to go into research and science and into positive things, obviously, but we need to get better use out of the resource. We need to get better value out of it. We don't need to be just sending it in truckloads of frozen product. We need to be able to maximising every piece of that fish, right down to the scales and the oil, the whole lot, not just down to the skip bin with it.
What is clear is that QMS has failed. It's a 30-year-old experiment in economics that has failed to do what it was primarily introduced to do: protect declining fish stocks. It has failed the fishermen, it has failed the regions and led to the loss of regional fishing ports and the destruction of small fishing economies. And it's failed Māori, giving away a valuable common property resource in perpetuity to a select few. Today, more than ever, we need to review what is right for us as a nation and what we must secure for the future. We need to ensure that the resources that our war chest must contain are protected at all costs.
The fish that's swimming out here right now, they belong to the people of New Zealand. Do you know what commercial fishermen pay to take our fish? Nothing. They trade quota amongst each other as a property commodity, but nothing goes back to the people of New Zealand, and they're our fish.
There is simply no place for quota management in our inshore fisheries. It's as simple as that. Every single pathway to abundance that we explore is blocked by property rights.
To me, a conversation about fisheries in New Zealand ought to encompass everybody. Because my guess is there are a lot of people who don't understand why commercial fishermen are getting free fish. They, as I like to say, tell me again why we're giving away this fish for free? I think there's a little old lady in Auckland who would like to ask that question.
So what are the alternatives? What is best for us, for our country? What is best for our regions, for job creation, and to ensure our food security in the future?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is we have to manage fish populations so that there are a lot more fish in the sea. We need to acknowledge that we should not push these fish populations down to a target of 35 or 25% of their original population size. And that means that their original ecosystem function is retained.
I think the answer is that we should have something with resource rentals rather than a property right. So the idea of saying to people, this fish is yours, either in perpetuity or in the long term, is just a crazy concept. Those fish belong to all of us. They belong to the public of New Zealand.
A renewable stock, the only thing you really care about is it's sustainable. That's number one. If you don't have that, you don't have a fishery. The rest of it is political choice about whose interests are worth catering to.
Now, one man who has been working tirelessly to find the answers to rescuing our fisheries is Barry Torkington. Now, based on the principles that we've understood as being right for New Zealand and also the problems that we're currently facing, Barry's got some pretty interesting ideas.
What we're suffering from in New Zealand is an absolute collapse of fisheries governance. And by governance, I mean the high-level maintenance of the environment, the maintenance of the fish stocks, the institutions and laws that govern our fisheries, that keep them healthy and abundant and able to be used. That has just given way And so now fisheries management is all about who can have what when. And it's arguing about who can catch what and how low can we go? How many more fish can we take before we're prevented from taking any more? What we need is to recapture a proper governance structure that puts the fisheries resources, the habitats, the stocks, front and centre of our law. We need a new Fisheries Act. The one that we've got now doesn't deliver for the well-being and interests of the people. It's our responsibility to our grandchildren to now stand up and demand reform, say this is not good enough, and if we carry on here, we're just robbing our grandchildren. That's all we're doing.
So how do we go forward?
I think that we need two things. First, we need to educate the public. I think we need to show Maori that there are choices. There are other ways of exercising and expressing their treaty rights and their interests. And then, of course, finally, there's politicians. We need political will because we need a change of law.
Setting up a series of principles on which to base that reform is fundamental to any way forward, isn't it?
I think it's ground zero. And that's not difficult to do. I think that we can take 80% of what the Faroese came up with and say, well, that applies to us as well. And we just need to make a couple of changes to reflect the treaty, and let's do it. Let's get going. Let's get this information out to the people. Let's get together with Maori and have this conversation and find out how everyone's needs can be met and what works for everyone. And I'm sure if those things are formed up, that the political will not be difficult. After all, the politicians, by and large, want to do what's right.
So reform seems the only way forward. A new system based on a set of principles that reflect who we are as a nation and what we want for the future. A return to smaller, more efficient boats and environmentally sound and sustainable methods. Allow populations of our fish to return to viable harvest levels. Elevate Māori to a status they were promised under the Treaty of Waitangi, sitting alongside government on governance. And the implementation of a resource rental that pays us, the owners of the fish, and gives funding to the science needed to manage our fish stocks efficiently. But to do this, the government would need to dismantle the QMS. So in all fairness to the quota holders, the government will need to negotiate the return of shares to the Crown. Remember, we're talking about buying back what is essentially ours already. After all, that's the law. The fish are the common property of all New Zealanders.
The fish belong to us. They belong to you. They're ours. They're ours. We should be incensed that it's been slowly eroded away from us. And then I'd like you to imagine what it would be like if there were no fish. If you didn't have any of your memories that you've got to this point in your life that involved going to the coast and digging some pippies, grabbing a mussel off the rock, spending time with your family, or that thrill of pulling in a fish. Imagine if that was wiped out. Well, that's the potential future that you're offering up for your kids and grandkids. Do we really want to be the generation that's known for letting it slip? You know, what I would love to see is to be the first generation in history that's handed on a better fishery than the one we inherited.
The trends I'm seeing globally are there's a drive towards accountability when it comes to proving that fish are sustainable or not sustainable. Accountability in terms of proving, are you being humane in your treatment and your management of, you know, these sentient creatures? That's pretty much absent from the equation. It's a big picture. It's a lot for the public to try and digest in one go. And I have complete sympathy for people that will watch a documentary like this and come away going, oh, wow, that was a fair chunk to digest, because it is a big chunk to digest. I guess the basic message to the public is, are you happy with what's going on? Is this lighting your candle? Is this what you expected from your government, from your industry? If it's not, what would you like to see changed? How do you think that should change? And go and support getting there. Give yourself permission to ask for that to happen. You know, there's only one blue rock spinning out in space that I know of, and we need to look after it, or we'll pay the price for not, you know.